in that terrible battle.
Вы понимаете, какое напряжение боя?
You can imagine how intense the fighting was for the city. We could only advance through the streets, and everywhere there were side streets, alleyways and subways. There was no unified front. Each objective had to be attacked separately. This is where the experience of the Stalingrad assault units was so useful.
Штурмовых групп Сталинград.
В середине улицы танки шли.
The tanks were in the center of the street. The self-propelled guns were on the pavement and they directed their fire at strong points.
А пехота вслед за
And behind us followed the infantry covering the basements.
подвалы.
But looming ahead of the advancing Soviet forces are colossal structures they cannot overcome. In the west, north, and east of the city are 3 impregnable anti-aircraft towers. Built to take on Allied bomber attacks, they decimate the advancing Soviet tanks.
Оказалось, что в 1 километре или 1,5 километра
They were steel reinforced concrete towers 6 stories high with heavy anti-aircraft guns on the roof.
на крыше зенитная батарея.
Our 203mm howitzers fired at them, but their shells made no impression.
Нашего корпуса. Вот, не пробивали. Ну, стреляли.
They were really powerful fortresses. We could fire as much as we wanted, but it was like shooting pellets at an elephant.
With no way of destroying the flak towers, Soviet troops have to bypass them and endure their fire. As the Soviet advance continues, German civilians take refuge in the cellars. But following on behind the well-disciplined front line, Soviet troops are men who care nothing for the rules of war.
We received telephone calls from the nurses in another hospital who were in tears as they described how they had been raped by Russian soldiers. And naturally, we were terrified that the same thing would happen to us.
By 5 p.m., 2 forces are closing in on the center of Berlin, the last defense area known as the Citadel. In the south, General Chuikov's troops reach the Landwehr Canal, only 2 miles from the Reichschancellery and Hitler's bunker. From the north, the 3rd Shock Army heads for the bridges over the River Spree and lead to the Reichstag. The defenders of Berlin have now been driven back into an area just 2 miles wide and 7 miles long. But in this last bastion are some of the city's most fanatical defenders. Tough veteran SS men are joined by teenage boys of the Hitler Youth.
I believed that using all our strength, we could still achieve something against the Russians. All my motivation, resistance, and courage would have been taken away if I hadn't believed that we could still defeat them.
But not every German soldier is willing to give up his life for Hitler. SS execution squads roam the streets in search of deserters.
When the SS began hanging deserters, the Germans themselves started to see the SS as the enemy. We saw a lot of ordinary German soldiers and officers who had been executed by the SS hanging from the lampposts.
I was shocked to see that soldiers were hanging from the trees. They had a sign put around their necks saying, "I was too cowardly to defend my country." And then they had been hanged. I was absolutely horrified. It was such an awful sight that I walked on looking only at the ground.
By 2 p.m., Red Army units have reached the Motka Bridge over the River Spree. 400 yards away through the smoke, they catch glimpses of the Reichstag. Infantry charge forward, but the bridge has been barricaded with barbed wire and mines. A hail of fire comes from the fortified buildings on the other bank. But Soviet troops push ahead with reckless courage. While his troops are fighting and dying in the ruins above him, Adolf Hitler goes through the motions of appointing a successor and dictating his will. And in a bizarre ceremony, finally marries his mistress, Eva Braun. The Third Reich is in its final hours. In the bomb-shattered buildings at the heart of Berlin, both sides now prepare for the last act of the Second World War in Europe. April 29, 1945. After 13 days of bitter fighting, the battle for Berlin is coming to a climax. From all sides, the Red Army is closing in on the city center. The Third Reich, which once spanned more than 300,000 square miles, is now a strip of land just 7 miles long and 2 miles wide. The men of the Soviet Third Shock Army prepare to advance the last few hundred yards to the Reichstag, symbolic heart of Hitler's Germany. On Stalin's orders, they carry red banners to place on its roof. But first they have to overcome the last fanatical defenders. As dawn breaks, Soviet reconnaissance aircraft take off to locate their troops' positions.
Berlin was covered in so much smoke. It felt as if we were flying in clouds. I could see Soviet soldiers, tanks and artillery, and I could smell burning. Everything seemed to be on fire. It was as if you were flying over hell, looking down into it.
Ahead of the Soviet troops lie the government buildings around the Reichstag. They are separated by the trees and undergrowth of the 500-acre Tiergarten Park. But the peaceful woods, which have been popular with Berliners for 200 years, are now a hell of splintered trees and trenches. The first obstacle to their advance is the heavily fortified Ministry of the Interior. Soviet soldiers call it Himmler's house. Under a storm of fire, they batter their way through the entrance and begin a desperate hand-to-hand fight from room to room. Outside, Soviet tanks become sitting ducks for German tank hunting squads.
Mein Nachbar, der eine Panzerfaust hatte, hat sich
The man next to me, who had a Panzerfaust, took up position on a pile of rubble, and I lay beside him. As the tank came in sight, at a distance of about 10 yards, he fired. We heard the screams of the crew, who must have been on fire. The tank commander struggled to open his hatch, and when he emerged, 5 of us fired our rifles, and he slumped forward. That was the only shot I fired at another man in the war.
The chaotic battle for Himmler's house goes on all night. Driven on by their commander's desire to see the red flag wave over the Reichstag in time for the May Day celebrations in Moscow, Soviet units suffer horrendous casualties. When Himmler's house finally falls, the assault troops try to storm the Reichstag. But on the open ground, they come under fire from the heavy guns in one of the bypassed flak towers. Soviet artillery and rockets lay down a barrage of shells at point-blank range to give the riflemen cover.
Es war mörderisch.